From Amanda Nunes leaving Juliana Pena with a bloody face, to Ronda Rousey almost breaking Miesha Tate's arm, women's UFC fights can get pretty brutal. So let's look at some of the best of them.
Beautiful finish, look at that.
Starting with Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Zhang Weili. This one took place all the way back in UFC 248. Back then, everyone considered Joanna to be a has-been, calling her one of the best female fighters in the promotion's history, who just fell off. On the other hand, you've got Weili, who had just defeated Jessica Andrade and was climbing up the ranks, even having an incredible record of 20-1. Of course, this fight had everyone hyped up. Everyone wanted to see the underdog go up against one of the biggest female fighters in the promotion. The fight went on for the entirety of 5 rounds. Both of them were so evenly matched that even after a winner was declared, no one could say who the true champion was. Though the fight itself was one of the most gruesome ones out there, both of them landed hit after hit on one another without catching a break.
Big connection by Jędrzejczyk.
But the most shocking part of it has to be the injury that Joanna got during the fight. Weili landed a punch directly on Joanna's forehead, ended up with a huge hematoma that would be there for the rest of the fight. Despite that, the fighter kept on fighting, and by the end of it, both of their faces were covered in blood, and even a full range of huge cuts and bruises you couldn't imagine. In the end, Weili won the fight, showing the world that she was ready to be a champion.
Truly epic fight. It was an honor to call your fight. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
While that's incredibly brutal, it's nothing when compared to Amanda Nunes versus Juliana Pena. This fight isn't just one of the most brutal ones out there, but is considered to be one of the best fights in the history of the promotion itself.
She just kept throwing, she just kept throwing, and then you saw the look on Amanda's face change.
It took place in the main event of the UFC 277, and if there's one thing I had to say about it, it would be that Nunes does not miss out on an opportunity to completely destroy her opponents. And that's exactly what she did over here. I have to give it to Pena though. She did put up some fight against her, but it didn't get her very far in the end, especially since this fight went on for a full 5 rounds as well. During one of the most insane fights out there, Pena ended up getting hit in the head and had a huge gash. Running so deep, the fighter had to be taken to a plastic surgeon to fix it. All the while, Nunes was basking in her victory. Even fans were left completely shocked by what they had just seen and went to Twitter to talk about it. People call her the GOAT and say it might just have been the bloodiest fight they'd ever seen. Not only did she prove that she was the better fighter, but she also proved that no one could dare to stand up to her.
Honestly, yo, when the Lioness don't get the praise for the first time, I said they dropped better, and I know I will get it the second time.
But if you think that's insane, wait till you hear about Paige Van Zandt versus Rose Namajunas. This one took place in 2015. The Women's UFC Fight Night 80 is the main event of the strawweight division. At the time, Paige was the new underdog who was quickly making her way to the top fighters. On the other hand, she was up against one of the most terrifying fighters in the promotion, none other than Rose Namajunas. The first few seconds of the fight might have made it look like Paige would stand a chance in the fight, but that was quickly turned around as her opponent absolutely destroyed her. In fact, she only managed to get a mere 33 seconds of control time in the entire fight. All the while, Rose had over 16 whole minutes of it. What made it even more brutal was the fact that during the entire fight, Paige's face was always covered in blood, and as the fight kept on going, it just kept on getting bloodier with no end in sight. From the very start of the fight, everyone knew who was going to win, but you couldn't help but respect Paige for not giving up the entire time. Ultimately, though, she was taken down with a rear naked choke submission that even left a deadly mark. But that's not where the fight ends. Paige still kept on resisting until the very last round. In fact, it took Rose 3 more submission attempts to finally make her crack. That's just how insane this fight was. The only bout that ever came close to it was Lauren Murphy versus Jessica Andrade. Murphy has been one of the most iconic fighters in the UFC. This fight took place in the flyweight division of the promotion, and boy was it a moment to witness, with both of them swinging at each other the entire time and not breathing for a single second, or at least it seemed that way. But Jessica completely annihilated her opponent, to the point that her face wasn't even recognizable by the end of the fight. Despite that, Murphy kept on fighting, but things only got worse for her from that point. Her entire face was red, with her forehead sticking outward and all of it completely swollen. But don't be fooled, because Jessica wasn't spared either. Of course, it was nothing compared to the damage that Murphy went through. In fact, even during the second round, commentators and fans alike were wondering why the fight wasn't being called off, but it just seemed like the referee was afraid to step into the madness that was going on between the two. Not only did Andrade prove that she's absolutely insane and is down to more than just destroying anyone who stands in her path to victory, but it also proved that Murphy might just be the toughest fighter out there who will do whatever it takes to fight. But speaking of tough, there's not a fight out there that comes close to Ronda Rousey versus Miesha Tate. The two have fought against each other a bunch of times, and it has been incredibly brutal every single time. But the one that really steps it up has to be their first fight against one another, taking place in 2012 in a series of MMA fights that both the UFC and Strikeforce planned. The two have had a really bitter rivalry with one another for a really long time now, and then it was finally time to take it to the cage. But Tate had no idea what was going to happen. In fact, the fight didn't even go on for a full 5 rounds, instead ending at just 3. Why is that? Well, she was completely dominated by Rousey the entire time, with Rousey punching and kicking her as she pleased. Though things really went up a notch when, for a moment, it looked like she broke Tate's arm. You heard that right. Tate's entire arm looked like it bent backward, and everyone freaked out.
She keeps pushing that arm across the face. Now Miesha's got to get out of there.
And she goes right back at her.
Miesha tags her.
I can absolutely never forget this bout. The next fight was no different. Let's talk about Valentina Shevchenko versus Amanda Nunes. While these two have gone up against each other a bunch of times, the first fight was arguably the most brutal one out of the bunch. Everyone considered Nunes to be the winner since the first round, especially since she was beating Valentina around. But the second round is where things took a drastic turn. By the end of it, it looked more like Nunes was the one that needed to be taken to a hospital, with a huge gash right above her eyebrow, spilling out blood all over her face. There's no denying that this fight was probably the ugliest one out there.
Now this is the finger injury. Keep an eye on there. See it right there? And Valentina immediately grabs her finger.
That's been a look into some of the most brutal women's UFC fights.